That brings us to question 4. A house divided. Our house.
Yes.
And again, I'll take a moment here to set it up. In a recent lecture on history, you said this. And this is yesterday, and I was taking notes. Countries that are defeated by their enemies often rebuild. But the countries that are destroyed from within, that's really the end of the line. All right. So again, let me take a moment to set this up. Ross Douthat in the New York Times earlier this very week, Douthat writes, the country is more ideologically polarized than it was 20 or 40 years ago. We're more likely to hate and fear members of the rival party, more likely to sort ourselves into ideologically homogenous communities, more likely to be skeptical about our own public institutions, more likely to hold conspiratorial beliefs. How Civil Wars Start is a new book by a prominent political scientist, and Ross Douthat writes that was cited all over the place in the days around the anniversary of last winter's riot at the Capitol, close quote. Polarization, even talk of civil war, slowing economic growth over the last couple of decades, I think most economists would argue, declining marriage rates, declining fertility rates. Last year, for the first time in the history of this republic, the population of the United States shrank. So the question is this. I think back to this recent history that you just mentioned. 1970s in this country, we have economic stagnation, collapse of national morale with Watergate and the defeat in Vietnam. We have an erosion of our position in the Cold War as the Soviets expand Africa, Latin America. And then the very next decade, we have economic growth, a restoration of national morale, and victory in the Cold War. From 1979 to 1989, 10 years, we go from the national humiliation of the hostage crisis in Iran to victory in the Cold War with the fall of the Berlin Wall. How bad is it now? And is this country capable of another act, another great act of self-renewal?
Let's admit, Peter, that that is the question. And let's also admit that I'm not an expert on the United States. I'm only a taxpayer. In fact, I pay taxes in New Jersey because I work at Princeton University. I pay taxes in New York City and New York State because I live in Manhattan. I pay taxes in Massachusetts because my wife works at Harvard. And I pay taxes in California because I'm an adjunct senior fellow at the Hoover Institution. I have not figured out how to pay taxes in Illinois yet. But that, obviously, I have to check that box, too, to get every single liberal.
High-tech state.
Yes. So I'm only a taxpayer. And you can see that I'm not very clever because I'm managing to pay taxes in all the worst jurisdictions for that. This is my take on that. We're not polarized, Peter, in the sense that polarization is a problem. This is a big and diverse nation. There are 330 million people, and we run the gamut from far left to far right and everything in between. And there are crazies, and there are people who think other people are crazy and vice versa, and we're America, and that's okay, and we've always been like that. It would be kind of bizarre if we didn't have a great diversity of opinion in our country. It would be weird. It would be inexplicable if, in fact, there was no intellectual diversity across, no political diversity across our country the way there is at our great liberal universities right now. It would be bizarre. The problem is not polarization. I was at the University of California, Berkeley in a PhD program when Ronald Reagan was president. So nobody's going to tell me that there's some type of political craziness now that's greater than what there was back then. The problem is demonization, not polarization. The problem is two people disagree, and they're evil for disagreeing. They're beyond the pale. And if they get back into power, the republic is over. And so everything becomes existential in a demonization situation. So if those guys get in, it's the end of our republic. And if those guys get in, it's the end of our republic. When something is existential, you have to fight to the death. And you have to use any means necessary, including breaking all norms, breaking your institutions. Because it's existential, it's the end of the republic. That demonization. Empirically, it's not the end of the republic. I'll remind your fantastic audience that Donald Trump was president, and we're living in the American Republic today. I'll remind your fantastic audience that Joe Biden is president today, and at some point will not be president again, and we will still be living in the American Republic. So the existentialism is a lie, and it's a mutually reinforcing lie, and it needs to be broken. The demonization is the problem. It comes from all sorts of good ideas that have had perverse and unintended consequences. Let's make who gets to be a candidate more democratic. Instead of a smoke-filled room, let's have a primary. And let's have only people of that party vote for their candidates, not cross-party primaries. And so a small percentage of one party shows up because they're the ones who go to vote in a primary, and they're a small percentage of the nation, and they produce the candidates that the whole nation then has to adjudicate. And it's what happened. These are our candidates. This is America. Can't we do better?
Right.
And so the idea of more democracy produced the demonization in part. And so we need less democracy. We need smoke-filled rooms again. We don't need these primaries, or we need primaries where everyone can vote no matter what party they belong to, and pick candidates who are more aligned with the median voter. Remember, our system is designed to thwart anything but a broad coalition.
Right.
And you can't form a broad coalition under demonization, can you? You can get 50% plus one, and you can ram through everything you think you need for your side because it's existential. You can get 3 Supreme Court justices and colossal tax cuts with the margin being too small to see without a microscope. And then the margin shifts. That same too small to see without a microscope, but it shifts the other way. And then you can reinvent all of our institutions from top to bottom, whether it's federalizing voting or some of the other things that are on the table now.
Right.
How silly is that? It's silly, yes, but it's because of the demonization, the existentialism, if the other side gets in, it's the end of the world. If the incentives change, the behavior changes. If you're incentivized to appeal in the primary to the median voter, you get a different candidate. If you're incentivized in the national, if your districts are not gerrymandered by the Democrats for their side and the Republicans for theirs. So there are many tweaks of our democracy that could get us back to making our system work, being aligned with the median voter, things not being existential, not getting everything you want with 50 plus 1%, no matter which side you're on. There are people out there who've diagrammed this pretty well, from Yuval Levin to all the other, Ross, all the other fantastic people you've had on your show and programs that I've watched. I'm not an expert, as I said. I'm just a taxpayer and an observer. But I understand incentives, and I understand that incentivizes certain behavior. Can we renew ourselves? Of course we can. How do we know? We've done it many times before. Many times. We did have a civil war. It was over something much deeper than any issue we have before us today. It was over the crime of slavery. There's no other way to describe it. Mm-hmm. People in this country were not considered human beings, let alone citizens. We rectified that. It was very hard. It was very costly. And it didn't end just with the Civil War, and the work continues today. And the Civil Rights Movement was a spectacular efflorescence of all races and all walks of life coming together to advance that agenda of the Civil War that was incomplete. That's within us. We know because it was there. We've seen it. We study that history. We understand it. We have the ability. We just need to incentivize different types of behavior. And we also need to revive civics, to remind people what institutions we have, how they work, why they're valuable, and why we are the nation that we are. It's not that hard, provided you change a few incentives, a few mechanisms, a few institutions, right? You know this with your kids. If you give them one incentive, you elicit one type of behavior. If you give them, and they're the same good kids that you raised. It's just you change their incentives a little.
Question 5, last